And all of a sudden, we seen this object. So I didn't know whether to stop, to back up, keep going, or what. So we just kept driving.
She took her wig off, and she had big patches of hair missing from her head. And that was so shocking. I said to her, I said, look, something very serious happened to you.
But here was this huge object and flames shooting from it.
Around 9 p.m. on December 29th, 1980, 57-year-old Vicki Landrum was riding in the front seat of her friend Betty Cash's car, with her 7-year-old grandson Colby, who she was raising, sitting between them. The trio had just finished dinner at a truck stop and were heading home, driving along a dark wooded highway near Huffman, Texas, a small town about 30 miles northeast of Houston. As they made their way down the road, Vicki noticed the windshield fogging up from the contrast between the cold air outside and the warmth inside the car. She turned on the defroster, and as the windshield cleared, she spotted a bright light up ahead, hovering over the trees.
And this object come down, almost to the treetops, almost ahead of us, and I screamed for Betty to stop. And I think if she hadn't stopped and we went on under it, we would have burned up.
At first, Vicki assumed they were near the Houston airport, and the light was just an airplane. However, as they continued along the winding highway, the light, which seemed to be coming from a landing plane, appeared to hover in place among the trees. In fact, as they drove, the light seemed to move closer and closer to them, making it clear it wasn't an airplane. Initially, Vicki found the light intriguing, but as they approached it, the atmosphere in the car began to change.
Well, I just had a feeling to look up in the sky. Then I looked around a little bit more and I saw that object. It looked like a diamond. It lit up the whole sky.
The interior grew much warmer and stuffier than the car's heating settings should have allowed, and soon Vicki was sweating and struggling to breathe from the heat. Everything was happening quickly, and Vicki's curiosity turned into anxiety as she began to question if the light was somehow causing the heat inside the car. Suddenly, the light, which had been partially hidden behind the trees, moved directly in front of them. Vicki shouted, "Stop!" and Betty slammed on the brakes. The car came to a halt, and about 100 feet ahead of them, hovering over the road, was a bizarre-looking aircraft. The source of the bright light was now unmistakably clear. It was coming from the craft itself. For a moment, the three of them simply stared in disbelief at the craft before them. It was so unexpected and so unreal that they couldn't process what was happening. Then Vicki, still panting and sweating, took a closer look and realized this craft was unlike any aircraft she had ever seen. It was slightly larger than a car, diamond-shaped, and emitting loud, strange, roaring noises, almost like an engine. The craft seemed to glow red-hot, and with each roaring sound, fire shot out from its underside, scorching the pavement below. Hovering just above the ground, it was positioned directly in front of Vicki, Betty, and Colby. Colby quickly began to cry, frightened by the sight. Betty, who was driving, explained that there was nowhere to go. The road was too narrow to turn around, and she couldn't risk driving forward under the craft and possibly being burned by the flames. They were effectively trapped. Vicki and Betty exchanged looks, silently deciding to wait it out, hoping the craft would eventually leave. But after several minutes, with the craft still hovering in place and spitting fire at intervals, they decided to step out and investigate. By now, their initial fear and panic had given way to an overwhelming sense of curiosity. What in the world could this thing be? Betty stepped out of the car first, while Vicki instructed her grandson to stay inside. Colby remained in the car as Vicki followed Betty out. The moment Vicki stepped out and got an unobstructed view of the craft, something clicked in her mind. Vicki, who was deeply religious, suddenly recalled a verse from the Bible. She remembered reading that one day Jesus would return to earth, and when he did, it would be in a rain of fire. In that instant, Vicky became convinced that what she was looking at wasn't just some kind of aircraft. It was the second coming of Jesus Christ. For her, this was a profoundly spiritual moment. Just as Vicky was about to move closer to get a better look at the strange object, she suddenly heard Colby calling out for her. He was crying hysterically, clearly terrified and distressed. This snapped Vicky out of her daze. She turned back and rushed to the car to comfort him. When she got there, she found Colby curled up on the floor under the dashboard, as if trying to shield himself from the craft. Vicky joined him, wrapping her arms around him and praying with him to help calm him down. Meanwhile, Betty stayed outside the car, staring intently at the craft. This continued for about 10 minutes, until Vicky, still crouched down with Colby, noticed the roaring sound from the craft growing louder, as if it was about to do something. She peeked up and looked through the windshield. Sure enough, the craft was lifting off the ground, rising higher and higher into the air. Flames were shooting out from its underside. Betty, still outside, continued watching it. Moments later, the craft shot straight up and began ascending at a steep angle. At the same time, Vicky saw a swarm of military-style helicopters appear, swarming around the craft as though escorting it. Together, the craft and helicopters disappeared into the horizon. After they were gone, it dawned on Vicky that what she had witnessed wasn't the second coming of Christ, as she had initially thought. The presence of the military helicopters made her realize it was likely part of a U.S. military exercise. A few moments later, Betty returned to the car and got into the driver's seat. Vicky climbed back into her own seat and lifted Colby onto the middle seat beside her. For a while, the three of them sat there in silence, processing what they had just experienced. With nothing left in their way, Betty eventually put the car into drive and slowly crossed over the scorch mark left on the pavement where the craft had been. About 45 minutes later, Betty pulled up in front of Vicky's house and parked. Vicky and Colby got out, said goodbye to Betty, and headed inside. They didn't really talk about what they had just witnessed. Instead, they simply said, "Good night," eager to get some rest. As Vicky was tucking Colby into bed, he began complaining about a stomachache. At the same time, Vicky realized she wasn't feeling well either. Shortly afterward, both of them were in the bathroom, vomiting. This alarmed Vicky. She tried convincing herself it was due to something they ate at the truck stop, but deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that their sickness was somehow connected to that strange craft. The night dragged on, with Vicky and Colby feeling nauseous for most of it. Eventually, they managed to fall asleep. The next morning, when Vicky got out of bed, she still felt terrible. She shuffled to the bathroom and, when she looked in the mirror, gasped in shock. Her skin was bright red and blistered, like she had a severe sunburn. At that moment, she was certain whatever was happening was linked to that craft. Panicked, Vicky rushed to Colby's room to check on him. He was still asleep, but she noticed his skin was also red and blistered in some places, though not as badly as hers. As she thought back to the night before, she remembered she had stepped out of the car and approached the craft, while Colby had stayed inside, huddled under the dashboard. It made sense. Her exposure to the craft must have been greater than Colby's, which explained why her symptoms were worse. Then Vicky recalled that Betty had been outside the car much longer than she had, standing there for 10 to 15 minutes, staring directly at the craft. A wave of worry hit her. If this is what happened to me, she thought, what must Betty be going through? Vicky hurried to the phone and dialed Betty's number. She listened as the phone rang again and again, but Betty never answered. By this point, Vicky was in full-blown panic, not only because she was worried about Betty, but also because she had no idea what was wrong with either her or Colby. She couldn't tell if their sickness was getting better or worse. She felt awful, nauseous, with her skin practically falling off. Colby wasn't in as bad shape, but he still wasn't well. On top of everything, Vicky didn't have the money to see a doctor. As much as she wanted to check on Betty, Vicky knew she couldn't. She had to focus on herself and her grandson first to make sure they were okay before doing anything else. Over the next few days, Vicky and Colby stayed home and slowly regained their strength. During that time, Vicky managed to get Betty on the phone. Betty told her she was experiencing similar symptoms, but was managing. This brought some relief to Vicky. Still, she knew Betty wasn't one to complain. Even if she felt awful, Betty was the type to keep it to herself and not necessarily tell Vicky. After 5 days, Vicky finally felt strong enough to visit Betty in person. When she arrived at Betty's house and stepped inside, she called out for her, but there was no response. The house was eerily quiet. Vicky started searching for Betty, walking through the house. Eventually, she reached the bedroom door, which was shut. She called for Betty again, but there was still no answer. Feeling a growing sense of fear, Vicky turned the doorknob and opened the door. What she saw immediately made her blood run cold. Betty was lying on the bed, looking horrific. She was barely conscious, her entire body covered in red, blistered, bleeding skin. Vomit covered the sheets, and clumps of her hair were scattered across the pillow. In shock, Vicky rushed to her side, lifted Betty up, and between the two of them, they managed to hobble out of the house. Vicky hurriedly placed Betty in the car and sped to the hospital. A few hours later, Vicky sat anxiously in the emergency room while Betty was being treated. When Betty's doctor entered the waiting room, Vicky jumped to her feet and rushed over to him. "What's happening to Betty? What's wrong with her?" she demanded. The doctor shook his head, his expression grim. "Your friend's skin is literally peeling off her face in sheets, and there are blisters all over her body," he said. He went on to explain that Betty's symptoms reminded him of radiation poisoning. However, he added that it seemed impossible. For a woman living in rural Texas, how could she have been exposed to something that radioactive? It just didn't make sense. When Vicky heard this, she instantly felt like she knew exactly how Betty had come into contact with something radioactive. It must have been the craft. Without thinking twice, Vicky began recounting the story of how she and Betty had seen the light, how the craft appeared on the road, shooting fire, and then flew off surrounded by helicopters. As she finished her tale, Vicky suddenly felt a wave of embarrassment, realizing that the doctor was staring at her as though she had completely lost her mind. A month later, in early February 1981, Vicky sat at her kitchen table, phone pressed to her ear. She was calling her local senator, someone she had already written to, about the strange aircraft that had made her and her friends sick. However, Vicky wasn't expecting much from the call, having been ignored many times before. At this point, Vicky and her grandson Colby had recovered from their nausea and burns, but Betty had not. She was still in and out of the hospital, in constant pain, with burns covering her body. Due to her ongoing symptoms, Betty had moved in with her brother. Vicky was convinced that Betty's symptoms were a result of radiation sickness caused by the aircraft's radiation. However, no one they spoke to about the aircraft believed them. Just then, Vicky heard a woman's voice cut through the hold music. It was the local senator's secretary. Vicky quickly explained why she was calling and why she was desperate to speak with the senator. The secretary simply told Vicky that she would pass the message along, and that the senator would be in touch. Then she hung up. For Vicky, this was the breaking point. She had tried going through the proper channels to figure out what the aircraft was and what had happened to Betty. But it clearly wasn't working. No one was taking her seriously. Frustrated, she slammed the phone down and just sat there, completely unsure of what to do next. As she sat in silence, Vicky remembered there was one place she hadn't contacted yet, and she hadn't wanted to. It was a UFO research center. Vicky hadn't called because she didn't believe the craft she'd seen was a UFO. She was certain it was a military aircraft, especially after seeing the helicopters escorting it away, which made the most sense to her. It had to be military. But if she called the UFO center, and people found out, they'd think she was crazy for even considering it might have been an alien craft. But now, Vicky felt like she had no other choice. She picked up the phone, grabbed the piece of paper with the number on it, and dialed. A couple of days later, a scientist named John Schuessler was driving down the winding, wooded highway toward Huffman, Texas. He was heading to meet Vicky. John was an aerospace engineer at NASA, but he also spent a lot of his time investigating UFO sightings. Vicky's call to the UFO Research Center had sparked a great deal of interest in the UFO community, and the story eventually reached John. He decided to take on the case. Now, it's important to understand that John wasn't into UFO research to prove the sightings were real. Quite the opposite. His goal was to investigate UFO sightings and prove that they weren't UFOs at all. He would find a logical, scientific explanation to debunk each sighting. That was his approach. So, with Vicky's case, his plan was to visit Huffman, Texas, speak with Vicky, and use science and logic to explain away what had happened. That this wasn't an alien encounter, but rather something more mundane, like a government aircraft. Eventually, John arrived at Vicky's house. He went inside, spoke with her, and she walked him through all the details of what had occurred. Afterward, they both left the house, got into their respective cars, and made their way to the location where the incident had taken place. When they arrived and John stepped out of the car, he didn't need Vicky to point out the exact spot, because right in front of him was a striking black circle in the middle of the road, as if the road itself had been melted, and then reformed. It looked distinctly different. Vicky said, "That's where it was. That's where the craft was hovering. Those marks are from the craft." This was strong evidence that a craft had indeed been there, but John wanted more. He needed to figure out what kind of craft it had been. So he told Vicky he was going to leave to canvass the area for witnesses and would keep her updated. After Vicky left, John drove further up the road until he reached some campsites and farmhouses. He methodically went from door to door and tent to tent, asking if anyone had seen or heard any aircraft or experienced anything unusual on the night of December 29th. John had no idea what to expect from the people he was questioning. He was just a random scientist showing up unannounced at people's homes, asking about strange lights in the sky. But to his surprise, every person he spoke to confirmed that, yes, they had seen that aircraft on December 29th. They had just been farther away than Vicky, Betty, and Colby. Now, John felt confident he had enough information to contact military officials. However, when he reached out to all the military bases in the area, every official he spoke to insisted that there were no military operations on December 29th. John found this deeply frustrating because, to him, it seemed obvious that these officials were lying to him. But what exactly they were lying about, and why, remained unclear. John actually visited these military bases to speak directly with the officials. When he did, he presented them with all the witness testimonies detailing what they had seen on December 29th. He also mentioned that he had personally seen the black scorched mark on the pavement, where it appeared the surface had actually melted in a circular pattern and then solidified again due to the intense heat from the craft. To John, that scorch mark almost seemed like proof that something had been there. Most likely, a military craft. But despite hearing his testimony and reviewing the evidence, the military leaders simply responded, "You can gather all the evidence you want, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't prove we were in the area. There was no military craft present that night." The bottom line was, the military insisted they weren't involved, and as a result, the case began to lose momentum. John returned home, but couldn't shake the case from his mind. He kept in contact with his witnesses and occasionally reached out to military officials, but nothing changed, except for Betty, who continued to worsen. Vicky also started developing severe symptoms, including cataracts in one of her eyes. Then, John received a panicked call from one of his witnesses. They told him they had just witnessed something truly astonishing. As John listened to the story, he felt his heart sink, because he now knew the military had been lying to him about their presence on December 29th. It was clear they had been there, and very likely it was their aircraft that had caused Betty, Vicky, and Colby to become so ill. But now, John also realized that any hope of proving this was lost, because the witness informed him that black government vehicles had arrived at the site, accompanied by construction vehicles. For no apparent reason related to traffic, they dug up a specific section of the road, took it with them, and left. The section of road that was removed just so happened to be the exact location where the scorch mark from the craft had been. It seemed as though the evidence was being deliberately erased. John wasn't able to return to the site himself to verify where the pavement had been cut. However, shortly after hearing about it, a group of UFO researchers went to the area to either find the scorch mark or prove that it had been removed, as the witness had claimed. When they arrived, they didn't find any scorch marks. Instead, they encountered fresh, newly paved road. The strange event that Vicky, Betty, and Colby experienced on the night of December 29, 1980, is widely regarded as one of the most famous and credible UFO sightings in history. This event became known as the Cash Landrum Incident, named after Betty and Vicky's last names. To this day, no one has been able to offer a logical explanation for what occurred if it wasn't a UFO. The U.S. government still asserts that there were no military operations taking place on December 29th. However, they explained that the removal of the road and repaving was simply part of routine maintenance. They insisted that they were not trying to conceal any evidence. As for Vicky and Betty, their health continued to worsen over the years. They eventually filed a lawsuit against the government, but because they couldn't provide proof that the aircraft existed or that it was responsible for their health issues, their case was dismissed. Both women eventually passed away from cancer, which Colby believes was directly linked to radiation exposure. As for Colby, he is still alive and continues to search for answers. So, thanks for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching it, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more content.